everyone. Before we dive into today's conversation, I have two exciting opportunities to share with you. First, February is Nonfiction Fest, a month long celebration of nonfiction writing for kids. Visit www.nffest.com for daily posts from some of the best in the business. It's an incredible chance to learn, connect, and get inspired. And speaking of inspiration, I'm thrilled to announce the next session of my Reimagine Your Writing Book Club starting February 25th. Over 6 90-minute live weekly sessions will work together to revise your work in progress, whether you're polishing an early draft or fine tuning a manuscript. Join a community of passionate writers and let's take your project to the next level. Learn more and sign up at writers.kirstenwlarson.com. Now, let's jump into today's episode of Nonfiction Kidlit Craft Conversations. Hello, and welcome to the Nonfiction Kidlit Craft Conversations podcast, where we take a deep dive into the craft and business of children's nonfiction featuring new release authors. I'm your host, Kirsten Larson, author of Reimagining Your Nonfiction Picture Book. Today, I have with me the fabulous Beth Anderson, author of numerous nonfiction picture books, including Hiding in Plain Sight, Kate Warne and the Race to Save Abraham Lincoln, illustrated by Sally Wern Comport from Calkins Creek. And that's the book that we'll be discussing today. Welcome to the podcast, Beth. Tell us about yourself and your book.
Well, thank you. I am thrilled to be here and share Hiding in Plain Sight. And this is one of those rare books that actually made it out of the drawer after being confined to the drawer for several years. And so it's interesting to see how the initial idea and, writing of the book changes when our world changes around us. Hiding in Plain Sight is the story of Kate Warren's role in the Baltimore plot, in foiling the Baltimore plot, which was the first attempt in our history to stop a duly elected president from becoming president. And so when that happened, that's when this came out of the drawer. And that's when this had a whole new angle to it because we were experiencing the same kind of crisis as was happening in 1861. So Abraham Lincoln had been receiving threats on his life for months after he was elected, and he was due to go to Washington, D.C. in February on a 13-day train trip across the country, and he would be inaugurated on March 4th. It was done a little bit differently at that time. But Kate Warne was the first female detective in the US, and she worked for Alan Pinkerton in the Pinkerton Detective Agency. And so her first real challenge there was convincing him that she didn't want to be a secretary, she wanted to be a detective because that had never happened before. And she told him how women could go to places and hear things and worm out information that men couldn't. And so he took her on, and she ended up being in charge of his female detective bureau, which was a division of the main agency. So to me, it was a fascinating story. I loved detective stories as a kid, and I was thrilled at the chance to take another crack at this, because the reason I stopped the first time was because there was another book or two that came out with her in it. And so I just figured the market couldn't, bear another one. And so I just waited. And it was a good thing I did.
Well, and I think that's what's so. First of all, I should say a lot of that backstory that you just mentioned about Kate Warne and her convincing Pinkerton to let her be a detective, et cetera, et cetera. None of that is in the main text of the
Right.
book, right? So that's
Right.
all. That's all happening before, and we don't even get into that. Um, so that kind of leads me into one of the questions that I had, which is, this started as a book about Kate Warne for you. But the finished product, you actually start with, instead of providing, you know, Kate's desire to be a detective and how she's struggling and failing to do that, and then finally has this, opportunity to help save Lincoln. You've actually started the book with Lincoln traveling to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. And then then we start to hear about Kate Warne and her role and what she's going to do to help foil this plot. Um, so you've started talking about this, but why did you choose to tell the story and start that way and to start it where you did with that focus on Lincoln?
Actually, I never set out to write biographies, but all the books that I've written are called biographies. I go after an event, usually, or an idea that we haven't explored before. So my focus is always on that action piece and not on the whole life. And sometimes you have to give a little bit of early years to establish things about a character before you can do that. But this one, it was better to jump right in to the situation. And for one reason is because we don't know a lot about Kate Warren before this happened. We have the basics of how she joined the Pinkerton agency, but I mean, we don't have a lot of details of her life. There are some books out there about her, but they're fiction. And people have sort of assumed and guessed things because there's not a whole lot of really hard information available. And so it was more about this event and how I could, look at this event effectively and make the story happen. Um, Carolyn Yoder was the editor from Calkins Creek, and she saw the greatest uh, feature of the story being the race. This race against time, this urgency. And so that's what she really wanted this to focus on instead of, oh, some of the interesting things I saw about, the parallels between Lincoln and Kate, and both of them were underestimated and didn't look the part kind of thing. But that really is beside the point because the excitement is in the race against time and that urgency.
Well, and one thing that I noted, I think as somebody who's a big fan of your work and has read all of your books, I feel like one thing you're really known for doing well is that sort of emotional through line and really figuring out the emotional heart of the story. And when you and I were talking before, this book is really different from what you traditionally write because it really reads more like a fast-paced thriller versus trying to really drill down. I mean, obviously there is a lot of emotion, but it's really a fast-paced thriller. So, let's talk a little bit about how you construct that. So, one thing I think a lot of people struggle with, myself included, is how to balance backstory and context without bogging down the plot. And like, how do we kind of dole that out in little bits using, planting only what kids need to know? Because you're dealing with this book, and even on the very first page, you're dealing with a lot of complex issues that might need explaining. The secession of the southern states over slavery, what's an
Yeah.
assassination and why do people want to kill Lincoln? So, can you talk to me a little bit about how did you think about trying to balance context without grinding your plot to a halt so that you could keep that race going?
That was the biggest challenge because the logistics of the story are different. They're so important to the risk and the stakes. And so you have to include that stuff. But the real judgment call was always, does this matter to understand risk and stakes and motivation? And does this matter to Kate's role? Because there's a lot of stuff about Lincoln, but it's not really Lincoln's story. And there were, I tried some different structures when I was working on this, and I was thinking dual timelines. We could see Kate doing this and we can see Lincoln doing this, and how their paths slowly come together. But that diverted from Kate and the emotion of her story. And so it was much better to just take her point of view, see what she saw, think what she thought, and just put it all in terms of what's going on with her and do the bare minimum of explaining. And like you said, there's a lot of that introductory piece, like about the Civil War coming, the secession, why they hate Lincoln, and all of that has to be there right up front. And you have to put it in terms for kids that haven't studied the Civil War, which is another challenge. And so how do you boil that down? And for the longest time, that was in the first scene with Kate in the hotel parlor. And so that ended up coming out and sort of acting as a little bit of a prologue, because that was a way I could present it clearly. I could keep the drama of it instead of trying to dilute it, weaving it through her thoughts and actions. And, that it's it sets up the bigger risk. She's got her goal, but there's a bigger goal. And what makes it so intense is that the whole nation is depending on these detectives, and her especially, foiling this plot. And so when you can set up that really heavy, big goal first and big problem, that's really your inciting incident. And so that kind of then goes and lays that all on Kate's shoulders as it moves to Kate. So that took a lot of back and forth and trying this and trying that in order to get those pieces in the right place. And that's just where it worked best. And the other thing about the urgency and pushing past, all the extraneous things that you don't need right away, is that when anybody picks up the book, they do it knowing that Lincoln became president, right? And so they really already know that she's successful. But you have to create such an urgency and such intensity that they sort of suspend that reality as they read it and get caught up in the race. And so when Carolyn put it that way, that, readers know what happens, right? When you already know the ending of this piece of history, then the carrying out of it has to be the pull, because you're not reading it for the ending, you're reading it for the chase, for the race.
Well, and that's what that's what I tell writers about pretty much almost every biography we write, like, or we read. We would not be reading the story if the person hadn't succeeded at whatever significant quest they
Right,
had. We would
right,
not be reading the story. And often the jacket flap even tells us that they succeeded, right? So
right.
you're right. It is about finding other ways to pull the reader through the story, often through the lens of getting so embedded with the character and with the character's emotions, um, that we're identifying with them and cheering them on and watching on the edge of our seat to see if they're going to succeed, even though in the back of our mind we know they did.
Yeah.
It's so interesting.
So it's the how that
Right.
matters. Yeah.
It's the how, and yeah, it's the how, and then also like the why, like why were they motivated, right? Like
Yeah. And
why
then
was it so important?
all that risk along the way, you know?
Exactly. Well, and I want to drill down to this because there was one particular spread, and I encourage everybody to read this book. It's truly amazing. But talking about tension, so there is one particular scene where Kate travels to New York to warn Lincoln. She's just checked into Astor House.
Mhm.
And when you look at what's really happening in this scene, in this section of the book, first she's waiting for Lincoln to arrive so she can deliver her message to his assistant, that he's in danger. Then she sends the assistant a note, and she's waiting to see if he's going to respond to her. Um, I mean, to be honest, like this could be in the hands of a less skilled writer. This could be very boring. It's a lot of twiddling of thumbs, waiting to see what's going to happen, and yet you have created a really tense moment on that particular spread where we're really curious, like, oh, how is this going to play out? So talk to me a little bit about some of the techniques that you used or the things that you were thinking about to really capture that tension on every single page.
Well, there's a lot that's actually left out of that scene. We don't talk about how women were treated at the time and that men didn't like to take advice from them. I had that in there a little bit for a while, but we just didn't really need it there. And then there's also the fact that the reason Judd was late, Mr. Judd, Lincoln's assistant, and that she had to wait so long was because he missed the train in Albany. But we don't need to know that. So that's not there. There's also the fact that she was meeting with one of the railroad officials too to find out about the train situation. And that's not in there at all. And it never was because it's just adding another character that doesn't matter that much. And so, yeah, where, this spread that you're talking about, there's really not much text there, but the urgency is set up before it in the spread before, because it ends up with the last sentence on that spread is they had 5 days to save Lincoln. So now we know time is of the essence. And so when you go to the Astor House spread, you got hours ticked away, no answer. Just as Kate counted the day lost, a knock. And so that piece there, very short sentences. The more short sentences you have instead of long sentences, slows down the text because those periods and those pieces of punctuation are stop signs and they make the reader stop. And then dropping things to the next line slows it also. So that I like to use short sentences and dropping things down the page as a way to slow the story and intensify the drama. And so that's something there, but it's all focused on time. And so you just learned that they have 5 days, and now one day has been shot.
Well, and you're threading that idea of time with the language that you're choosing. You keep kind of referring back to that idea of time lost and time wasting, and time is of the essence. You're kind of continuously referring back to it.
Yeah, because on that page before, they know they have to do something, and that's where that timeline starts of 5 days. And then almost every page has a countdown piece of the time. And it starts with the days, and then it goes down to hours as this gets closer and closer, and they're still desperate to make something happen to foil the plot. And so you also get some of the dangers filtered through Kate, because she's watching for Lincoln to come. She arrives at 4 a.m. and he doesn't get there till the middle of the afternoon. And so she's all this time she can't sleep and she's pacing, but that's not on the page. you know, so she checks in and she waits. And then she's been watching, and when she sees Lincoln arrive, you see he's in an open carriage. You see that she's thinking, she's looking at the crowd. She studied the crowd, how many Southern rebels were out there watching his every move. And one of the books I read that's for adults about the Baltimore plot, there's three that are just fascinating, and they all take different angles, which is interesting. One of them is following John Wilkes Booth through all of this too, and I believe he was there. And there were Southern rebels that were watching his every move. And so to put that in her mind and let it come onto the page, she had to be thinking about it. She knows that how much danger is out there, and that people are watching and looking for opportunities to attack Lincoln. And so, that's just kind of what makes that little bit intense, is because you become more aware of dangers and this time ticking away.
Well, and like you said, then, aside from the time taking away, you're filtering it through her experience. And, I think that's another area of your writing that I really admire. I feel like you do interiority really well. One technique which you just mentioned was sort of that rhetorical question that sort of puts us in the mind of your character. Um, and I mean, that's another element that I wanted to talk about, because even though this is such a fast-paced plot focused thriller, it's still very much Kate's story, and I feel like it can be really difficult to get. Sometimes in a really fast-paced thriller, it can be hard to get readers to connect emotionally with the main character. So, what are some of the strategies that you used, or the things that you were thinking about, to try to help readers connect with Kate and what she's trying to do?
Well, I do love the interiority, and I think it's vital. I use that, and I use a very close point of view. There's a thing called psychic distance or proximity, where you feel this distance as the reader from that character. And so I try to inhabit that main character and let it come through what she's feeling and what she's thinking. Because there's a few spots in there where Kate isn't involved in what's happening, but she knows what's happening and she's waiting for the results. And so to pose that, instead of dumping the information like Pinkerton was doing this and he asked Lincoln and Lincoln refused, she's thinking about it because she's waiting for the answer. So she knows that Pinkerton is talking with these people and he's trying to convince Lincoln to go along with their plan. And so it comes through as her questions. Could Pinkerton convince Lincoln to change his plans, kind of thing? And so by letting that come through the main character, it pulls that reader into the experience of the main character, and you start to feel her tension and her worry and her that great responsibility that's resting on her because she's got a key role coming up, and if she fails, the whole nation's at risk.
Well, and I think that's so interesting because it is really important, I think, for every page to have some kind of, to hold some kind of question for the reader, something that the reader's wondering about that's going to force them to turn the page. And you do that so well, of kind of planting questions that the questions that she has are also the questions that the reader is going to naturally have, which is,
Right.
how's it going to turn out? What's going to happen next? And there you are, showing her on the page, kind of thinking through these things as well. So again, the reader is really living her experience.
Yeah, I'm trying to dig into what is it like to be her. What is she feeling? What is she thinking? And so the reader can understand that these people have self-doubt too. These people are scared. You know, all of these people we write about in history, they had these same feelings that we do. And that helps to connect the reader to that experience and feel like I want kids to understand that they're a part of history. They, and trying to think about the pandemic is really easy to understand that because it changed how we think about things. It changed how we do things. So every little thing that happens is part of our experience, and we are living history. It's here, it's around us. Things we do matter.
Yeah.
How we
Well,
respond matters.
no, you're exactly right. Well, and let's talk a little bit about research, because to write that level of interiority, what kind of research do you need, and how does your research, particularly your primary sources, inform your ability to tell such an exciting story?
Well, I learned a few books. Well, probably in Lizzie Demands a Seat was the one that really taught me that setting is everything. And you can't just research the character you're working on. You have to research everything around them, everything that impacts their lives. And so you're looking, I mean, even like with Deborah Sampson, what books would she have read? Because we know we are impacted by what we read. And there were very few books at the time. So if you look at what's there in their time period, in their little world, in their community, in their family, in their neighborhood, what is affecting how they think, then you can start to understand what's going on in their experience. And so, looking at newspapers, looking at books that are available, looking at impactful people that they came in contact with, all of that, I think, is a huge contributor to not only that person's experience, but to the conflict. Because if you don't understand things about the setting, you're missing a lot of the conflict and the stakes and the risks that are out there. For example, the railroads, I mean, you wouldn't normally think that, changing trains is a problem because today we would walk through the station and get on the other train. Well, it wasn't like that then. Trains didn't meet at one station in a city. One was on one side of town, another leg of the train was on a different side of town. Sometimes there were laws about trains going through cities. They were all basically owned by different companies, usually, and so they didn't connect. And the fact that Lincoln had to travel from one side of Philadelphia to the other, from one side of Baltimore to the other to catch the next leg of the train, opened him up to the public and all the dangers of being out there unprotected, by being in the train. So things like that. How do you hide this guy who's so recognizable? He's tall, he's gangly, thin, he wears a stovepipe hat. Everybody knows what Lincoln looks like. And that's one of those seeds that's planted in that Astor House spread too that you mentioned. Everybody knows him. And so, you see him in a carriage, there's no doubt, right?
Well, and I think what's interesting, you're talking about all this research, and a lot of that becomes context for you because you aren't including every single last detail in your picture book. You just don't have
Right.
space for it. So then you have to be choosy about what has to be in there, right?
Right. And there's so much that I learned that doesn't go in the book at all, not even in back matter, but it makes me understand the consequences and how, risky this is and dangerous and, all these things that are happening. And people would doubt one of the greatest resources was Pinkerton's book that came out later about because people said, oh, you just made this up so you could be famous. But he ends up starting the Secret Service, basically. But he says, no, this was real. And when you start digging into the research, you see that there was somebody else who came to Lincoln and said, you're in danger in Baltimore too. So it was coming from different sources. So that's one thing. But then Pinkerton's book later, he asks, the railroad executive, Lincoln's assistant, all the people that were involved, he asked them to write what happened, that he wasn't making this up. And so you get this piece of history through different eyes,
What a gold mine.
through different points of view. The problem was that Kate had already died by that time, and so we don't get her point of view. But there are some books that have her detective notes where she recorded what she did on every day. And they were just short little bits, but you have that, which is very valuable, but also seeing, what the train owner said and things like that. It's really helpful.
Well, and one thing that I think you almost start to inhabit your character, right? You've talked about this. So you need like these boxes and boxes of research and all these books so you can kind of inhabit your character because aside from like factual truth, there's also emotional truth. And so I feel like part of our job is to know our characters so well that we do have a pretty good idea of things that they must have been thinking about. Even if we don't have a direct source from Kate saying, on this day, I was wondering about
Yeah.
XYZ, right? Knowing how she operated, knowing how the detectives operated, the fact that she knows what Pinkerton's going to do, you can reasonably assume that as she's waiting for Pinkerton to get back with her and tell her, how things are going, you can reasonably assume, given what you know about her and her job and how she worked, that she is mulling some of these things over, right? So you don't have to
Right.
have everything written down in stone saying, I thought this, I felt this, right? So I don't know if
Right.
you can talk, that I will say that's one thing that it took me a long time to figure out. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or kind of what that process is like for you, trying to draw inferences.
I think it goes back to the setting on the research because if you can understand what's going on around them, it helps you understand what's going on inside of them. Like when the train is going from Philadelphia to Baltimore, there's some great stuff that I left out because it might divert the story to the other Pinkerton detectives. But on the way there, you know, in the setting, again, there's wooden bridges that cross rivers and valleys. There's a place across the Susquehanna River, I think, where they had to take each car separately on a ferry to cross the river and get to the other side and get back on the track. So these are all really intense danger points, but they're not in the book. But what you see is Kate peering out the window, and you see that she's worried and she's watching, and she's, just the tension because saying that she kept going to the back door all the time and looking out the window all the time because of these dangers, then you got to start explaining the dangers. And then that kind of pulls out of this tense ride to Baltimore. So I think just the more you can learn, I mean, research not only deeply but widely. I wouldn't have ever guessed that they would put cars on a ferry to cross and get on the railroad tracks on the other side. But this is 1861, so the world was different. And kids don't think about that. They don't think about using the only quick form of communication was the telegraph. So trying to not to let this word spread, you got to cut the telegraph lines. And then what does that do? That alerts people. It's just all those little details are just golden when you're trying, even if they don't make it on the page, because now you understand what's going on in her.
Right. Right, exactly. And they can't go on the page, right? Because then if you had to explain every little detail, then you're stopping this, railroad ride of a story because it's so fast-paced and exciting. So yeah, I mean it's such a fine balance, and I think I just really admire how you've done it.
Well, a lot of that comes from the editor. Like, this is slowing down here. You got to do something. You can take out this. You don't need that kind of thing. So I couldn't do that myself.
Well, and I think that's really important, right? I mean, this is not a solo process. So even
Right.
if even if your book hasn't been acquired yet, this is an area where having a reader, a cold reader, a critique partner, they can help you pinpoint where things are not are slowing down or grinding to a halt, and then those are areas that you can look at.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's never a solo process, that's for sure.
No. And then when you see the art too,
Mhm.
sometimes you can pull a little bit here and there because you can see it.
Right. Yeah. And I mean
But
the art, yeah, contributes so much visual detail.
but I also try to think about, well, the art can show this, but they can't show this.
Hmm.
So I have to do what's going on inside because that's not going to be in the art. And you have to
Y-
think about what can the art show and what can't it show.
Exactly. Exactly. And I have had, I don't know about you, but I have had instances in some of my books where after we got the sketch dummy, I was able to cut quite a few words because it's like, okay, well, we see that in the art. My words don't have to duplicate, what's already there. So it's a cooperative process at all
It
levels
is.
with your
It
critique
is.
partners, your editor. Even if you're not working directly with the illustrator, you're in conversation with what's happening in the art. So picture
Yeah.
books are a magical process.
They are. And it's kind of an intricate dance, of the back and forth and how you figure out how to get all that on the page.
Yeah. Well, I absolutely love this book. It has
Thank
been a
you.
fabulous, and I think it will be a very instructive conversation for people. So, where can readers connect with you and buy your books?
Well, my website is bethandersonwriter.com. And I have a blog where lots of authors and illustrators share parts of the process, and those are just fascinating articles, and I learned so much from them. But the book, Hiding in Plain Sight, is available at booksellers everywhere. If they don't have it in a store, you can order it. I mean, or you can order it online from all the major booksellers and independent shops, all that good stuff. And
Well,
I do have an educator's guide that is downloadable on my book page on my website for it. And I also try to, over the next few months, I'm making little bits for educators, teachers to use in the classroom. And hopefully we can do some virtual visits or real world visits and chat with kids.
awesome. Well, I will link to your website in the show notes, and I will also put a link to your educator's guide for educators who may be listening. And I just really appreciate it, Beth. I'm wishing you all the best with your future projects.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. To get the full transcript of this podcast, sign up for my newsletter at kirstenwlarson.com. It will be sent out with the next mailing. All backlist episodes are available on the podcast page on my website. You can watch on YouTube or listen wherever you get your podcast. And of course, I appreciate it if you rate and review it, especially on Apple Podcasts. Join me next month when I talk to Native Hawaiian author Kamalani Hurley, author of Ka Hau'aulave, The True Story of an Island and Her People, illustrated by Haranani Orme from Millbrook. We will discuss the process and choices involved in telling a story from the point of view of an inanimate object. So stay tuned. Want to shape the conversation? Join my Reimagine Insiders paid community. This month, we are discussing the 6 essential questions to help you sort through your story ideas. Details about the community and how to join are on my website. Until next month, happy writing and revising, and thanks for listening.